The Chichijima Incident, September 2nd, 1944, 19,000 feet above Chichijima. The Avenger's engine coughs black smoke across the Pacific sky. Lieutenant Junior Grade George H.W. Bush grips the stick with both hands, fighting to keep the torpedo bomber level as flames lick at the cockpit glass. Below him, the volcanic peaks of Chichijima pierce through morning clouds like broken teeth. His two crew members, radioman John Delaney and gunner Ted White, are already gone, killed by the anti-aircraft fire that turned their aircraft into a flying coffin. Bush's parachute blooms white against the endless blue. You can almost feel the silk snapping taut in the tropical wind, the harness cutting into his shoulders as he descends toward the dark waters where Japanese patrol boats are already turning in his direction. But fortune or fate intervenes. The submarine USS Finback surfaces 3 miles away, her crew pulling the young pilot from the waves just as the enemy boats close in. He doesn't know it yet, but George Bush has just become the only one of 9 American airmen shot down over Chichijima who will survive what's coming. The island below is barely 10 square miles of volcanic rock and dense jungle, a speck in the Bonin Islands chain, 600 miles south of Tokyo. To the American bomber crews flying from carriers like the USS San Jacinto, it's just another Japanese stronghold to soften up before the inevitable invasion. Radio towers pierce the jungle canopy. Concrete bunkers dot the hillsides. Anti-aircraft batteries track every plane that enters their airspace. What the Americans don't know, what no one outside this island knows, is that Chichijima has become something else entirely. Behind the conventional fortifications, beyond the radar installations and supply depots, a darkness has taken root that will shock even those who thought they'd seen the worst of what this war could produce. Major Sueo Matoba commands the 308th Battalion here. At 41, he's a career soldier who's watched Japan's empire crumble island by island, his men's morale dissolving with each American victory. The supply ships stopped coming months ago. Rice rations have been cut, then cut again. His soldiers subsist on sweet potatoes and whatever fish they can catch. And now the Americans come daily, their B-24 Liberators and Avengers dropping tons of ordnance, turning his defensive positions into rubble. Vice Admiral Kunizo Mori oversees the naval garrison from his headquarters carved into the volcanic rock. He's a man who speaks often of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, and how it will overcome material disadvantages. But privately he knows the war is lost. The Americans will come, not just with their planes, but with their invasion fleets. When that happens, Chichijima will fall. The only question is how many of the enemy they can take with them. The island's commanding officer, Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, has arrived just months ago from the collapsed Manchurian front. He's seen what happens when Japanese forces are overwhelmed, the shame, the dishonor, the choice between surrender and death. Here on Chichijima, surrounded by water with nowhere to retreat, he's determined that his garrison will choose neither. They will find another way to demonstrate their warrior spirit. It starts with rage. When the air raid sirens wail and the bombs fall, when another gun emplacement is destroyed and more Japanese soldiers are buried in their positions, the fury has nowhere to go except inward, feeding on itself. The officers gather in the humid command bunker, maps scattered across bamboo tables, trying to defend against an enemy they cannot reach. The Americans own the sky. The Japanese Navy, what's left of it, huddles in home waters. And then the airmen begin to fall. September 3rd, 1944, dawn. Radioman 3rd Class James Wesley Dye Jr. hangs in his parachute harness, drifting toward the jungle canopy of Chichijima. His Avenger is a distant fireball now, cartwheeling into the Pacific after taking a direct hit to the fuel tank. At 19 years old, from Mount Ephraim, New Jersey, Dye has been in the Pacific Theater for 11 months. He's seen combat over Truk, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, but nothing has prepared him for what waits below. Japanese soldiers are already moving through the underbrush, following his descent. They've gotten good at this, tracking the parachutes, triangulating where the Americans will land, getting there before the airmen can dispose of their gear and try to evade. Dye crashes through the tree branches, his chute tangling in the dense vegetation 20 feet above the ground. He hangs there, suspended, fumbling for his knife to cut himself free. The first Japanese soldier to reach him is a private from the 308th Battalion, screaming in a language Dai doesn't understand, jabbing upward with his bayonet. More soldiers arrive, and together they cut him down. Dai hits the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. Hands grab him, rifle butts strike his ribs and shoulders. They tear away his survival gear, his sidearm, the escape kit sewn into his flight suit. They march him through the jungle paths, his hands bound with rope that cuts into his wrists. You can imagine the heat oppressive, humid, the air thick with rotting vegetation and volcanic sulfur. Insects cloud around the cuts on his face. His flight boots, designed for aircraft pedals, not jungle hiking, slip on the muddy trail. Each time he stumbles, a rifle butt drives him forward. The Japanese soldiers are shouting, celebrating. They've captured an American airman, a prize that might earn them extra rations, perhaps recognition from their officers. One young soldier, barely older than Dai himself, keeps poking him with his bayonet, drawing thin lines of blood through the flight suit. It's sport to them now. At the 308th Battalion headquarters, Major Matoba waits. He's ordered all captured airmen to be brought to him personally. When Dai is pushed through the entrance, Matoba studies him with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. Here is the enemy, not the abstract American devils of propaganda posters, but a frightened young man with sandy hair and blue eyes, bleeding from a dozen small wounds. Matoba speaks through an interpreter, a Korean conscript who learned English before the war. The questions are military: what ship, what squadron, what targets. Dai gives his name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. Matoba nods, almost approving. He respects the adherence to military protocol, even from an enemy. But respect and mercy are different things entirely. Over the next 2 weeks, 8 more American airmen will parachute onto Chichijima, Aviation Ordnanceman 3rd Class, Grady Alvin York, 19, from Oklahoma, Aviation Radioman 3rd Class Lloyd Richard Wolhoff, 21, from Missouri, Gunner Kenneth Lloyd Frazier, 22, from Kansas, Lieutenant Junior Grade Warren Earl Vaughn, 23, from Texas, Petty Officer Marv William Mershon, 23, from California, Radioman Glenn Frazier Jr., 19, from Alabama, Aviation Pilot Floyd Ewing Hall, 24, from North Carolina, and finally, on the 16th of February 1945, Marine First Lieutenant Warren Earl Vaughn's wingman, whose name has been lost to history. Each is captured within hours of landing. Each is brought before Japanese officers for interrogation. Each gives only the required information under the Geneva Convention, and each is then imprisoned in makeshift cells, caves carved into the volcanic rock, bamboo cages near the battalion headquarters, converted storage bunkers that flood during the frequent rains. The guards take turns tormenting them. Beatings are routine for speaking, for not speaking, for looking at a guard, for looking away. Water is withheld in the tropical heat until the Americans' tongues swell and crack. Food, when it comes, is a ball of moldy rice or a sweet potato so rotten even the starving prisoners struggle to keep it down. But this is just the prelude. September 15th, 1944, the Officers' Club. Humidity hangs in the air like wet wool as Lieutenant General Tachibana raises his sake cup. The Officers' Club, a grand name for what amounts to a reinforced wooden structure with a tin roof, is packed with senior military personnel. Outside, you can hear the distant rumble of American bombers making another run at the radar installations. The building trembles slightly. Dust drifts from the rafters into the rice wine. The Americans believe they are warriors. Tachibana says, his words slightly slurred from drink. But they are soft, weak. They do not understand the true warrior spirit, the willingness to do anything for victory. Vice Admiral Mori nods, his own cup empty, waiting for a subordinate to refill it. Major Matoba sits cross-legged on a worn tatami mat, his sword across his lap. The blade has been in his family for 3 centuries, carried by samurai ancestors who would be horrified by what their descendant is about to propose. The men are starving, Matoba says quietly. The supply situation is critical. We have perhaps 2 months of rice remaining, even at current rations. It's a practical concern, delivered in the tone of a quartermaster reviewing inventory. But everyone in the room understands the subtext. They've all heard the stories from other islands, Japanese soldiers eating grass, bark, leather equipment. Some units in New Guinea, cut off and desperate, went further, much further. The prisoners, Tachibana says, setting down his cup with deliberate precision, are a drain on our resources. The words hang in the humid air. Outside, an anti-aircraft battery opens fire, the rhythmic thump, 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 providing a martial soundtrack to the conversation. No one speaks for a long moment. They're balanced on the edge of something, and they all know it. Captain Shizuo Yoshi, the garrison's medical officer, clears his throat. From a medical perspective, he begins, then stops, choosing his words carefully. From a medical perspective, the human body contains significant nutritional value. Protein, primarily. In extreme survival situation, he doesn't finish. He doesn't need to. The ancient warriors, Admiral Mori says, his voice taking on the cadence of mythology, would consume the flesh of their enemies to absorb their strength. It was not cannibalism, it was a sacred act. A warrior's ritual. Major Matoba's hand moves to his sword hilt. My men need strength. The Americans grow stronger while we grow weaker. Perhaps it is time to remember the old ways. What happens in that room the exact moment when military officers cross from contemplating the unthinkable to planning it is lost to history. But by the time the sake runs dry and the meeting ends, a decision has been made. The American prisoners will serve the Japanese war effort in a way they never imagined. The first to die is aviation ordnanceman Grady York. On the morning of September 17th, guards enter his cell, a concrete box barely large enough to lie down in. York has been here 2 weeks. His ribs show through his flight suit. Infected wounds from beatings weep yellow pus. When they drag him out, he can barely stand. They tell him he's being transferred to Japan for further interrogation. It's a lie designed to keep him calm, compliant. York manages to walk, supported between 2 guards, down a jungle path that leads away from the main compound. You can picture him squinting in the sudden sunlight after days in darkness, perhaps feeling something like hope. Transfer to Japan means POW camps, Red Cross inspections, survival. The execution site is a cleared area near the 308th Battalion headquarters. A wooden post has been driven into the volcanic soil. They tie York to it, his arms behind his back. He's mumbling something, prayers perhaps, or messages for family he knows he'll never see again. Major Matoba draws his ancestral sword. The tradition of kaishaku, the beheading stroke in ritual suicide, requires precision, honor, a clean cut that ends suffering instantly. But this is not kaishaku, this is murder. Matoba has been drinking since dawn, fortifying himself for what he's about to do. His first stroke misses the mark, cutting deep into York's shoulder. The young American screams a sound that carries through the jungle, causing birds to burst from the trees. It takes 3 more strokes. September 17th, 1944. Evening. The officers' mess has been transformed. Where normally the garrison's senior staff would gather for meager rations and military planning, tonight there's an almost festive atmosphere. Lanterns have been lit despite the blackout regulations. Sake flows freely from the strategic reserve. And on the low bamboo tables, arranged on the garrison's best ceramic plates, are strips of meat, grilled over charcoal and seasoned with soy sauce, and what little ginger they have left. Captain Yoshi, the medical officer, supervised the preparation. In the afternoon, he had gone to the execution site with a surgical kit. What happened there, the precise cuts, the selection of specific portions he would later describe in clinical detail during war crimes testimony. The liver, he told the guards assisting him, was particularly rich in vitamins. The muscle tissue from the thighs and buttocks would provide the most substantial meals. The heart, he suggested, should go to General Tachibana himself, a warrior's tribute. Now, in the lamplight, 24 officers eat in silence. You have to understand the psychology of this moment. These are educated men, graduates of military academies. Some have traveled abroad, speak English, understand Western customs. They know what they're doing violates not just international law but basic human morality, yet they lift their chopsticks, they chew, they swallow, Lieutenant Commander Hayashi, who oversees the Naval Communications Unit, will later testify that the meat tasted like pork but stringier. He ate because everyone was eating, because to refuse would be to mark himself as weak, uncommitted to the warrior code that Tachibana and Mori constantly preach, peer pressure and alcohol and the collective madness of isolated men who've convinced themselves that normal rules no longer apply. Major Matoba sits at Tachibana's right hand, drinking heavily but eating little. The execution has affected him more than he expected. Not guilt, he will never express guilt, but a kind of nervous energy, a need to justify what they've done. The Americans, he says, loud enough for all to hear, would let us starve. They bomb our supply ships, blockade our islands, and expect us to surrender from hunger. We are merely turning their own warriors into our strength. It is justice. Admiral Mori raises his cup. To the Emperor, he says, may our spirits be worthy of his glory. To the Emperor, they respond in unison and drink. Outside, Private First Class Fumio Tamamura of the 307th Battalion stands guard. Through the windows, he can see the officers eating, drinking, occasionally laughing at some comment he cannot hear. He knows what meat is on those plates. All the enlisted men know. The smell of grilling flesh has drifted across the compound all evening, and the prisoners' cells are one man emptier. Tamamura hasn't eaten real meat in 6 months. His stomach cramps from hunger, a constant companion that keeps him awake at night. Tomorrow, he knows, there might be extra rations. Not the choice cuts the officers are enjoying, but something. Enough to quiet the pain for a few hours. This is how atrocity spreads not through grand evil gestures but through hunger and hierarchy, through men telling themselves that survival justifies anything, that following orders absolves individual choice. 3 days later, they come for Lloyd Wolhoff. The radio man from Missouri has been watching the guards, noting patterns, trying to figure out what happened to York. When his cell door opens unexpectedly outside the usual interrogation schedule, he knows. You can see it in his eyes. The guards will later testify. Not surprise, but recognition. He's figured out why the Japanese have been keeping them alive. Wolhoff fights. Despite weeks of starvation and beatings, he fights with the desperation of a man who knows exactly what awaits him. He breaks one guard's nose with his forehead, kicks another in the groin. It takes 6 men to subdue him, to drag him thrashing and screaming to the execution ground. This time, General Tachibana himself wields the sword. October through December, 1944, the autumn rains come to Chichijima, turning paths into rivers of mud, flooding the prisoner cells, making life miserable for captive and captor alike. The Americans keep coming too, their bombers appearing daily now, systematically destroying everything of military value on the island. The radar station is gone. Half the anti-aircraft batteries have been silenced. The runway, cratered so many times it looks like the moon's surface. In his flooded cell, aviation radioman Glenn Fraser Jr. scratches marks on the concrete wall with a piece of metal he's hidden in his boot sole. Not counting days, he's lost track of those, but counting the screams. The screams when they come for another prisoner, the screams from the execution ground, and then, worst of all, the silence. 5 men have been taken now. York, Wolhoff, Fraser, Kenneth, not Glenn, Mershon, and Hall. Each time following the same pattern. The lie about transfer, the march to the killing ground, the sword or bayonet or rifle butt, and then the surgeon's knife. Glenn knows he's running out of time. The Japanese guards have begun to show signs of psychological fracture. Some drink themselves unconscious every night, trying to forget what they've participated in. Others have embraced the barbarity, requesting portions of flesh as rewards for particularly brutal interrogations. Private Tamamura, the guard who watched that first officer's feast, now volunteers for execution duty. He's developed a taste for it, he tells his squadmates. It makes him feel powerful, like a true warrior, but it's Captain Yoshi, the medical officer, who has undergone the most disturbing transformation. What began as clinical detachment, a medical professional simply following orders, has evolved into something approaching enthusiasm. He conducts what he calls experiments, keeping portions of tissue alive in saline solution, studying how long human flesh remains viable in tropical conditions. He lectures junior medical staff on optimal butchering techniques, drawing diagrams on a blackboard as if teaching anatomy class. Lieutenant Junior Grade Warren Earl Vaughan is captured on October 5th after his Hellcat fighter is shot down during a strafing run. At 23, Vaughan is older than most of the captured airmen, a Naval Academy graduate who speaks some Japanese from pre-war studies. This makes his imprisonment worse, not better. He understands what the guards are saying. He comprehends the discussions about rations, about protein, about the next special meal for the officers. In December, as the American invasion of the Philippines rages to the south, General Tachibana decides the garrison needs its spirits lifted. Morale has collapsed. Soldiers desert their posts during air raids, hiding in caves rather than manning their weapons. Some have been caught trying to construct rafts, insane attempts to escape across 600 miles of open ocean. We will show them that the warrior spirit remains strong. Tachibana announces at the officers' meeting. A feast. A proper feast. Open to all ranks who have shown proper fighting spirit. This time, they take 2 prisoners on the same day, Warren Vaughan and Marv Mershon. The execution ground has been expanded, cleared of undergrowth, almost ritualized into a place of dark ceremony. Vaughan is brought out first. He's been tortured for information about American naval operations, his fingers broken one by one when he refused to talk. Now he can barely stand, swaying between his guards. Major Matoba has prepared a speech. He talks about Bushido, the warrior code, about how the Americans lack honor because they bomb from high altitude rather than engaging in proper combat. Vaughan, who understands every word, begins to laugh. It's a broken sound, more sob than mirth, but it enrages Matoba. The major doesn't use his sword this time. He beats Vaughan to death with a baseball bat taken from the garrison's recreation supplies. February 1945. The Pacific War has turned into an American avalanche. MacArthur has returned to the Philippines. The Marines are preparing to invade Iwo Jima, just 150 miles north of Chichijima. B-29 super fortresses from the Marianas pass overhead daily, so high the anti-aircraft guns can't reach them, heading for Tokyo itself. On Chichijima, only 2 American prisoners remain alive, James Dye and Glenn Fraser Jr. They've survived through a combination of luck, timing, and the bizarre protection of Admiral Maury, who has decided to keep them as special prisoners for intelligence purposes. In reality, Maury is hedging his bets. He knows the war is lost. He knows the Americans will demand an accounting. These 2 living prisoners might be his bargaining chips, but General Tachibana has other ideas. The general has descended into what can only be described as madness. He conducts sword practice at all hours, screaming at subordinates for imagined slights, ordering executions of Japanese soldiers for defeatism. He's convinced that Chichijima will be the site of the final battle, where the Japanese spirit will turn the tide of war through pure will. On February 16th, another American goes down, a Marine pilot whose name has been lost to history. He's captured immediately, interrogated briefly, and executed within hours. This time, there's no pretense of ceremony or warrior tradition. He's simply butchered like livestock, his flesh distributed to various units as special rations. The enlisted men no longer pretend they don't know what they're eating. Some refuse and are beaten. Others have crossed a psychological line from which there's no return. They've normalized the horror, integrated it into their daily reality. Human flesh is just another protein source in a world gone insane. Glenn Fraser watches from his cell as guards carry packages wrapped in palm fronds past his window. He's figured out the schedule now. Executions in the morning, butchering in the afternoon, distribution before the evening meal. He's also noticed something else. American submarines have been spotted offshore. The invasion is coming. On February 19th, the Marines land on Iwo Jima. The sound of naval bombardment carries across the water to Chichijima on still nights. Every Japanese soldier knows what this means. Iwo Jima will fall maybe in days, maybe in weeks, but it will fall. And then it's Chichijima's turn. Panic spreads through the garrison. Some officers advocate killing all remaining prisoners immediately, leaving no witnesses. Others argue for using them as human shields. Admiral Maury proposes a different solution: transfer Dye and Fraser to the home islands before the Americans arrive. But it's too late for transfers. American submarines have made the waters around Chichijima a killing ground for Japanese vessels. The last supply ship was torpedoed 3 weeks ago within sight of the island. They're completely cut off. In his headquarters, General Tachibana makes a final decision. If Chichijima is to be the garrison's grave, they will meet death as warriors. And warriors, he declares, feast before battle. The order goes out. Prepare the remaining prisoners for a final ceremony. March 20, 1945. Dam. James Dye wakes to the sound of his cell door opening. After 6 months of imprisonment, torture, and watching his fellow airmen disappear one by one, he knows this is the end. The guards' faces tell him everything nervous, avoiding eye contact, hands tight on their rifles. But something is different this morning. In the distance, he hears a sound that's become familiar: aircraft engines. American aircraft engines. Not the high-altitude bombers, but lower, closer. Fighter bombers from a carrier task force. The guards hesitate. Radio operator Private Iwakawa runs toward the cells, shouting something in rapid Japanese. The garrison is under direct attack. American planes are strafing the compound. The execution is postponed. For 2 days, the Americans pound Chichijima without mercy. Napalm turns the jungle into walls of fire. Rockets destroy what's left of the coastal defenses. The Japanese garrison, what's left of it, huddles in caves and bunkers, waiting for the invasion that must surely follow. But the invasion never comes. The American High Command has decided Chichijima isn't worth the casualties. With Iwo Jima secured, they have their emergency landing field for B-29 seconds attacking Japan. Chichijima will be bypassed, left to wither on the vine, like so many other Japanese garrisons scattered across the Pacific. The reprieve saves Dye and Fraser's lives. With American ships constantly visible offshore, even Tachibana doesn't dare execute the remaining prisoners. They might be needed for negotiations, or as proof that some Americans were kept alive. The guards still beat them, still starve them, but the killing has stopped. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender. The garrison on Chichijima refuses to believe it at first. Tachibana declares it's American propaganda, a trick to make them lower their guard. But when Japanese naval officers arrive from Tokyo with official surrender documents, reality can no longer be denied. On September 3rd, 1945, 1 day after the formal surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay, the destroyer USS Dunlap arrives at Chichijima to accept the garrison's surrender. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Presley Rixey leads the landing party, expecting to process a defeated but conventional Japanese military unit. What he finds instead shocks even battle-hardened Marines. Dye and Fraser, the only surviving American prisoners, are walking skeletons. Dye weighs 91 pounds, down from his pre-capture weight of 170. Fraser can't speak above a whisper, his vocal cords damaged from months of screaming during torture. They're carried to the Dunlap on stretchers, both men weeping not from joy but from the simple relief of human touch that doesn't bring pain. But it's what Dye and Fraser tell the intelligence officers that transforms a routine surrender into a war crimes investigation. They ate them, Dye says, his voice flat, emotionless. They ate them all. At first, the Marine interrogators don't believe it. Cannibalism? It seems too grotesque, too medieval for the 20th century. But Fraser corroborates every detail: the executions, the butchering, the smell of grilling flesh that haunted the compound for months. Navy investigators, led by Lieutenant Commander James Robinson, begin questioning the Japanese garrison. Most deny everything, but under intensive interrogation, some crack. Private Tamamura, trying to save himself, provides dates, names, specific details about who ordered what, who participated, who ate human flesh. Captain Yoshi, the medical officer, maintains his clinical detachment even in custody. He provides a detailed account of his procedures, even offers to draw diagrams showing how he sectioned the bodies for maximum nutritional value. He seems genuinely puzzled by the Americans' revulsion. In war, he explains, one does what is necessary to survive. The evidence mounts. Graves are discovered, though most contain only partial remains. Cooking equipment tests positive for human blood and tissue. Multiple Japanese personnel independently corroborate the same events, though each tries to shift primary blame to others. The War Crimes Trials, 1946 to 1947. The tribunal convenes on Guam in August 1946. 5 Japanese officers face charges of murder, cannibalism, and violations of the laws of war. Lieutenant General Tachibana, Vice Admiral Mori, Major Matoba, Captain Yoshi, and Lieutenant Colonel Ito, who oversaw several executions. The prosecution, led by U.S. Navy Captain John Robinson, presents evidence that seems almost impossible to believe. Photographs of the execution grounds. Testimony from Dye and Fraser, both men still bearing physical and psychological scars. Japanese witnesses who describe in detail the feasts where American flesh was consumed. Major Matoba's defense is particularly chilling. He doesn't deny the charges. Instead, he argues that consuming enemy flesh is an ancient samurai tradition, a way of absorbing the enemy's strength. When asked if he feels remorse, he replies, "I feel remorse that Japan lost the war, nothing else." General Tachibana claims he was following the customs of war and that the extreme conditions on Chichijima justified extreme measures. His attorney argues that the Americans' blockade and bombing campaign had created starvation conditions, driving men to desperate acts. Admiral Mori maintains he tried to protect some prisoners, pointing to Dye and Fraser's survival as evidence. But testimony reveals he personally ordered at least 3 executions and participated in multiple cannibalistic feasts. Captain Yoshi attempts a medical defense, claiming he was conducting legitimate research into survival nutrition that could have benefited all humanity. The tribunal judges are visibly disgusted as he describes his experiments with the same detachment one might use to discuss laboratory rats. On September 12, 1946, all 5 primary defendants are found guilty. Lieutenant Colonel Ito receives life imprisonment. 12 other Japanese personnel receive lesser sentences ranging from 5 years to life imprisonment for their participation in the murders and cannibalism. Private Tamamura, despite his cooperation with investigators, receives 20 years. The executions are carried out on September 24, 1947. General Tachibana's last words are, "Long live the Emperor." Major Matoba says nothing, maintaining his warriors' silence to the end. Admiral Mori asks that his personal effects be sent to his family, along with a letter expressing no regret for his actions, only for his failure to achieve victory. Captain Yoshi requests that his medical notes be preserved for science, seemingly oblivious to their horrific nature even at the gallows. The Chichijima Incident remains one of the Pacific War's least known atrocities. Unlike the Bataan Death March or the Rape of Nanking, it doesn't appear in most history textbooks. The U.S. military, perhaps considering the details too disturbing for public consumption in the immediate post-war period, classified much of the trial evidence. Many documents weren't released until the 1992nd. George H.W. Bush, who would become the 41st President of the United States, rarely spoke about September 2, 1944, the day he was shot down over Chichijima and rescued by the USS Finback. He knew what happened to the 8 airmen who weren't rescued. During his presidency, when asked about his wartime service, he would simply say he was one of the lucky ones and change the subject. James Dye returned to New Jersey after months of medical treatment. He never fully recovered. Physically, chronic digestive problems plagued him for the rest of his life. He married, had children, and worked as an electrician, but he never spoke about Chichijima, not even to his family. He died in 1998, taking most of his memories with him. Glenn Fraser Jr. struggled with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though it wouldn't be called that for decades. He drank heavily, couldn't hold jobs, and was haunted by nightmares where he could smell cooking meat. In the 1960 seconds, he finally found some peace through therapy and veteran support groups. He became one of the few Chichijima survivors willing to talk about what happened, believing that silence only protected the guilty. He passed away in 2002. The families of the murdered airmen York, Whalehoff, Kenneth Fraser, Vaughan, Mershon, Hall, and the others were told only that their loved ones were killed in action or died while prisoners of war. The true circumstances weren't revealed to most families until the trial transcripts were declassified. Some never learned the full truth. Chichijima itself was returned to Japanese sovereignty in 1968, along with the other Bonin Islands. Today, it's a quiet place with a small civilian population, known for its diving spots and pristine beaches. There's a memorial to the war dead, both Japanese and American, but no mention of what happened there in 1944 and 1945. Tour guides, if asked, will say only that unfortunate events occurred during the war. The jungle has reclaimed the execution ground. The cells where Dai and Fraser spent months in terror have crumbled. Nature has erased most physical evidence of the horrors that took place on this small volcanic island. But history remembers, even when we'd rather forget. The Chichijima Incident stands as a reminder of how quickly civilization's veneer can crack, how ordinary men can become monsters when isolated, desperate, and convinced that their cause justifies any action. It reminds us that war's greatest casualties are often not those who die, but those who survive with their humanity intact. In military archives in Washington and Tokyo, the full trial transcripts run to thousands of pages, testimony, evidence, photographs that even 75 years later are difficult to view. They document not just individual acts of evil, but the systematic breakdown of moral boundaries, the group psychology that allows atrocity to become routine. 8 American airmen flew over Chichijima and never came home. Their families received telegrams, folded flags, and gold stars to hang in their windows. They didn't receive the truth that their sons, husbands, and brothers had faced something worse than death, something that civilized nations had convinced themselves was no longer possible in the modern world. The last word belongs to Glenn Fraser, Jr., from a 1995 interview. People ask me how I survived when the others didn't. I don't have a good answer. Luck, timing, maybe God's plan, I don't know. But I do know this. I survived to tell what happened. Those men, my friends, they deserve to have their story told. Not the sanitized version, but the truth. They faced evil, real evil, and they faced it with courage. That's what I want people to remember, not just the horror, but their courage in the face of it. The Chichijima Incident wasn't just a war crime. It was a mirror, reflecting the darkest possibilities of human nature when all moral restraints are removed. It's a history we'd rather forget, a story we'd rather not tell. But forgetting is a luxury the dead don't have. And so we remember.